So good morning, Kamal, and a pleasure to have you on board and to talk about the 10 years before 2000, but also the 20 years since, because you have made a significant contribution, wearing many hats over the last 30 years. So how did you initially get engaged in DRR work, particularly before 2000?
Oh, I think it was very simple. I was studying architecture, and while I was studying architecture, the place I was studying, Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee, which is the current name of the institution, not far from there was a big earthquake. And I had been trekking in that area just a few weeks before the earthquake. So I thought I should do something there. And then I got involved in, helping some NGOs there. And then I started working for an NGO full-time as soon as I graduated to build earthquake-resistant houses using, as far as possible, local materials, vernacular techniques, improved for seismic strengthening of buildings. And that's how I got into it. I thought I will use my architectural skills for rebuilding houses after an earthquake. And that was the first time that I read Ian Davis's book called Shelter After Disaster. And I began to realize that it is not just about technology, it's not just about building techniques, but there's a whole lot of social, economic, political issues that underpin how we either build risk or build resilience into our communities.
Yeah, you may like to also elaborate on the specific disasters that you were involved in India, and then how you transited to the next phase of your work before.
So the first one that I just mentioned, it was 1991 Uttarkashi earthquake. It was, I believe, October 20th, 1991. And that was in the hills. It was a big earthquake, nearly 1,000 people died. Considering that population density in that part of the country is less, it was considered massive. So we spent a year rebuilding a village there, a village which was not even connected by road, using local materials. And soon after we finished that work, in 2 years later, there was another earthquake in Maharashtra, down south, Latur earthquake. That was September of 1993, if I remember correctly. So then I started working there. So these were the two earthquakes that I worked early on in the early 90s that essentially led me from mainstream architecture to working in disaster risk management.
You then move on. You did further studies, and you did some work while you were studying, and later you got employed and continued with the same theme. So just sketch that out and talk about the differences, and maybe even
it's a very
name of the
story.
organization. Wait, even talk about TARU, if you don't mind. Mention the name of the organization, the NGO which you worked in India.
So my work in India in both the events was with TARU, which is now called TARU Leading Edge. At that time, it was a not-for-profit organization, and it was a group of professionals, a very interesting group of professionals from multiple disciplines. The first time I interacted with somebody from TARU was actually a geologist, and before that I had never spoken to a geologist professionally, so that was interesting. So it was a multidisciplinary group of young people, a very flat structure, who wanted to apply their advanced professional technical skills for social good. So that was the kind of setting. It was a great learning opportunity because it really got me out of my comfort zone of what I knew, which was architecture a little bit, to knowing other disciplines, to looking at rural development, geology, looking at civil engineering. Of course, civil engineering is quite related to architecture, and other fields, water resource management. So it really gave me a broader picture. And then after 3 years, I thought I should study some more, and I went to Asian Institute of Technology to study housing and urban development. And while I was doing that, as it would happen, less than 2 weeks after I arrived in Thailand, there was an earthquake in Kobe. And on the campus of the Asian Institute of Technology was ADPC, the Asian Disaster Preparedness Centre. So the day after the earthquake, I just walked into ADPC and said that, look, I have some experience of working on post-earthquake recovery. Can I do something for you as a student or an intern to support Kobe recovery? They were very nice and they entertained me. I still remember the first person I met at ADPC was a librarian, actually. Gunilla Gustav's Finnish lady, very, very nice. And she said that, well, I mean, we don't do direct support work in developed countries like Japan, but come back in a couple of weeks, I'll introduce you to someone who has a background similar to yours, which was my friend who unfortunately passed away some 10 years ago, David Hollister. So David Hollister himself was an architect who had strayed into disaster management. And he said that, you know, maybe Dave can help you. And Dave said that, look, I am setting up this Asian urban disaster mitigation program, which basically, you know, he is, you know, at that time I was studying urban planning. So urban planning, housing, I was studying. So it will be a nice thing if you could work here as an intern and support me in some aspects of doing the background research on the development of the program. So then I became a regular visitor into the ADPC offices as an intern, you know, not just during the day, but also in the nights, using their facilities to also do my own thesis work. And then because I was working with Dave, I decided to do my master's thesis as well on disasters. And I looked at Delhi, you know, I did vulnerability assessment of a small settlement, low middle income settlement in Delhi with regards to earthquakes. I distinctly remember that was 95, 96. That time when I was talking about studying vulnerability to earthquakes of settlements in Delhi, people were looking at, why are you doing this? Is Delhi really earthquake prone? I mean, literature was there that Delhi is earthquake prone, and it was in zone 4 in the 5-band seismic seismic zonation of the country. But the general awareness was not very high. So from there to now, I think things have changed quite dramatically. So that was with ADPC, and then with ADPC, I worked for many years. I worked for almost 6 years, and during that time as well, I was I sort of stopped doing work on earthquake-related stuff and more gradually on other aspects. Although I did one small piece of work on earthquakes there. You know, providing some support to a reconstruction effort in Indonesia, in Sumatra Island, Liwa, a village, a school building. And then the El Nino happened in 97, 98, and then changed many things. ADPC got involved in looking at the impacts of El Nino and La Nina. So, you know, I ended up working on that. So that took me to another sphere of disaster risk management, looking at climate and weather-related disasters and disaster risk. So that's been the journey of most of the 90s.
You talked about some of your achievements, share some of the challenges that you faced, both personally and institutionally in the context of ADPC.
I don't know whether I can attribute any achievement to myself as such. I think most of the times it's really being at the right time at the right place. So it's not like I had any foresight that climate related work or working on El Nino and La Nina is the most important thing to do. I was there, somebody needed to do that work, and I ended up doing it. So I think a few things, I think any achievement I can say is any achievement that I can somewhat attribute to myself is my own learning. In terms of contributing to the world, so many things have to come together for the world to really change. That to attribute, to claim credit for that is a bit preposterous. And presumptuous. So I think what I would say is that the flexibility in sort of moving across different kinds of hazard risks, looking at social sciences, getting comfortable talking to meteorologists and climatologists, talking to geophysical engineering people, geotechnical engineering people. I think that is, engaging with a wide spectrum of people. We did some interesting work at ADPC when I was there on forest fires as well. Tremendous learning. Before that, I knew nothing about forest fires. So we did some work with UN Habitat in East Kalimantan on looking at the impact of forest fires on human settlements. And as you go into it, you realize how huge and how complex this whole field is. So I think one of the challenges, so personal challenge, of course, is that your peer group always thinks that you are crazy, that you are, rather than focusing on what you studied, which is architecture. There are very few people who do not do commercial architectural practice right in the beginning and then just delve into something completely unrelated with a lot of uncertainty about how the work will progress. And the second thing is that quite as a sort of wrong notion, it was seen, at least in 90s, disaster risk management as a very niche, very small, narrow profession. But the more you sort of engage with this area of work, you realize how complex it is and how it connects with almost every sphere of human endeavor. Once you begin to realize that, it really becomes very, very exciting. So, you can basically touch any aspect of human existence, and there is a risk dimension to it, and there is something for you to work on, something for you to contribute, something for you to learn. So, in the last 20 to 25 years, I've had the opportunity to work on urban floods. I would have the opportunity to work on landslides in Thailand, of all the places, on El Nino, La Nina, forest fires. We've had a chance to look at glacial lake outburst floods. I worked on disaster risk management in museums and cultural heritage sites. We're going to start something on preserving manuscripts in libraries from the impact. So it's really, the scope of engagement can be really wide, almost too wide to be able to sort of. So I think that's the most exciting thing about disaster risk management, that as opposed to the notion we had 2 decades ago, it is really, you can do almost anything you want in this area of work.
No, you've made a significant contribution, and you've had a lot of learning from each of the professional engagements with the four or five institutions you've worked. So I would like you to reflect a little bit on these first 2 institutions, or maybe just focus on ADPC for the moment. And then I'll ask you further questions about UNDP and the current occupation. So let's at the moment focus on some of the lessons learned and for the institution.
So I think for ADPC so I joined ADPC when ADPC was less than 10 years old. And so it was, now when I look back, I realize how young an institution it was. Although it didn't look like that to me back then, it did look like quite a mature institution. So many ways, ADPC and its founders, particularly Brian Ward, really had the foresight that, you know, ordinary mortals like us can only dream of having that kind of foresight about the state of the world. And it was really ahead of its times in more ways than one. It was an institution which in many ways combined the efficiency of private sector. You know, it didn't have a lot of room to, you know, fiddle around. It really had limited budgets and it really had to deliver things very efficiently. And the deep commitment of a voluntary organization to sort of be honest to the cause. And at the same time, bring about the comprehensiveness of a public sector organization. So basically never say no to anything, work across the spectrum. So, I mean, some of these things were also ADPC's weaknesses. You know, every strength can be seen as its own mirror in terms of its weakness. So it was a great place, and I think more or less at ADPC, if you could find funding something, you could do anything. So from a learning perspective, I think ADPC was great. From an impact perspective also, it was great. I think the kind of work we did, you know, Subaya's work in Philippines in the wake of 97-98 El Nino, I think that just that one consultancy must have saved the Filipino people, you know, millions of dollars in terms of averted losses from El Nino and efficient management of the available resources. So, and also I think creating a whole generation of people on disaster risk management or working on disaster risk management before the topic became more widely recognized as an area of practice. So ADPC was great, and I think you know, in many ways, you know, that was really my TARU and ADPC. These were really my growing up years in this line of work.
You've also made a rich contribution to ADPC at a time when there was transformation underway, and it has now moved to being an international organization, and that stands you in good stead in the role that you're playing currently with them. But let's move on to the next institution you worked with. So tell us about how you moved and where you started out with work in UNDP and when.
So with UNDP, I started after 6 years. I started working for UNDP. I was regional advisor for UNDP in South and Southwest Asia. I was based in my hometown in Delhi, working across the region, ranging from Iran to Bangladesh, with some engagement in Central Asia as well. So that was a very, very interesting experience as well. And also UNDP itself and UNDP's work in the area of disaster risk management was coming of age in a large measure because of the individuals involved, the leadership at that time provided by Andrew Mascri, who had brought his own rich experience of having worked in the non-government sector, in the sort of knowledge side of things in Latin America. So it was perhaps the most exciting time to work on disaster risk management at UNDP. UNDP had, even before I joined, in preceding years, many disaster risk management projects. You know, I mean, some of them we were involved in from ADPC side as well, capacity building of national institutions in Cambodia, Laos, and so on. And many of those projects were good, but they were sort of cookie cutter projects. They were same sort of template applied across country. And UNDP didn't really have a solid practice of disaster risk management to speak of. So they were more sort of country level initiatives and, somewhat scattered. At least that's what was my impression. I may be wrong. And when Andrew headed the global team, the global practice team, for the first time, ADPC recruited these regional advisors in all the regions, two in Asia, two in Africa, in Central Asia, in Central Asia and Europe, in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, and then a further level of, recruiting national advisors to support UNDP country offices in some high disaster risk countries. There were several regional initiatives. There were some thematic initiatives. There was an initiative on systematically looking at institutional and legislative systems for disaster risk management. I think some of the findings of that work, some of the recommendations of that work back in 2004 are still quite relevant. And you can actually see the fingerprints of that work on the developments that have happened in many, many countries around the world. Similarly, systematizing work on risk identification, the work on high resolution disaster data sets, the work on climate risk management. I think the first discussion that, or at least one of the first discussions that we had on bringing together climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction work was convened by Andrew Mascri and Alain Lavelle in Cuba back in 2002. So it was a very exciting time. And also UNDP was a slightly different platform, or a quite different platform compared to ADPC. It was different in three important ways. One was that it had country presence and formalized relationship with the host government. So there was an agreement for, to working over 4 or 5 years. So you felt much closer to the government, and you were sort of course, being very close to the government from the UN side also comes with its challenges. The second thing was that it had other practices. So, you had people working on poverty, you had people working on HIV/AIDS, people working on governance, people working on environment. So, horizontal linkage with other countries was, other areas of development was possible. And the third way UNDP platform was different was that there was a possibility of sustained engagement with the country. So, take, for example, UNDP currently in India. So UNDP's work on disaster risk management in India started in a formal sense in 2002, 2003. There were initiatives before that as well. But since then, there is a continuous stream. So, I mean, the kind of institutional memory UNDP country office here has, and the fact that it is in the long haul for on this sector in the country where it is working. So these were very interesting things. And of course, there were some political dimensions to it as well. One of the first things that Andrew assigned me was to help develop a regional initiative based in Iran, covering the Economic Cooperation Organization countries, 10 countries, very, very complicated. And of course, while I was at UNDP, it was also my first 5 years at UNDP. In all, I worked 13 years, very, very eventful, particularly in South and Southwest Asia. We had big floods after a long time in 2003 in Sri Lanka, floods and landslides in 2003. We had soon after that the Bam earthquake in Iran. We had massive floods in Bangladesh in 2004. And of course, the, at that time, at least, mother of all disasters, the Indian Ocean tsunami, which affected so many countries at the same time, and most of them in my region. And, where country offices I was supposed to support were there. And then within less than a year, we had the earthquake in Kashmir, which was 2005 October. So it was very eventful. So as a result, of course, I was quite involved in working with UNDP country offices on coming up with recovery strategies. UNDP had come up with, not the UNDP, the UN system had, under its humanitarian reform, organized humanitarian response across different clusters. And I was the first person to roll out the early recovery cluster in Pakistan after that. So there was a lot of learning from that. Prior to UNDP, I mean, of course, at TARU, I had worked on reconstruction, but that was really reconstruction, not comprehensive recovery. So UNDP also gave me an opportunity to work on recovery alongside the government agencies, very closely with governments on this thing. So that was on post-disaster recovery. And then you began to see how recovery is also something that requires better preparedness to launch strong recovery programs. Otherwise we tend to sort of reinvent the institutional systems for managing recovery every time an event happens and so on, and how you use recovery as an opportunity to push disaster risk reduction as well. So my UNDP years, first 5 years, particularly in the field, were very, very rich. Then my next step, again with UNDP, was that I moved as the senior program advisor to Geneva, where I had more of a global overview. In that global overview, I was able to sort of help continue to build the global team of disaster risk management professionals in different parts of the world of UNDP. And that was more a program management role as opposed to direct delivery role, direct technical advice role. So it comes with its own rewards and challenges. The reward is that your footprint increases. You become an enabler of teams. The challenge is that if you worked in the field all the time and you're not getting to go and talk to people who live in disaster-prone areas, people who are affected by disasters, you also begin to feel that you're losing the connection. But UNDP really allowed me to sort of strike a balance. So, even though I was in a global management role from time to time, 2008, Pakistan floods, for example, I had the opportunity to go out and work in the field with colleagues in country offices and keep that connection as well. And from there, my next step was to go even more remote from the field of action, which was the UNDP headquarters in New York. But then again, fortunately for me, it was a very interesting time. We were 2 or 3 years off from the completion of the Rego framework. The MDGs were coming to an end, and there was a lot of negotiation in the run-up to Paris. So that was a very interesting time, and I was able to sort of find very interesting opportunities. And on behalf of UNDP, I worked on how we can inform the post 2015 development frameworks, including post Rego. We did a series of global consultations to bring in disaster risk management related elements into the SDGs, which I think it was a successful endeavor. I was also able to work with UNDP at a more strategic level, looking at other sectors, other practices as well. So that was a great opportunity as well. So the more remote you get from the field, the more difficult it becomes to keep the connection with the real world issues. So one has to make a conscious effort to keep that connection alive. But at the same time, it gives you the satisfaction to have a bigger picture, have a larger footprint, understand broader processes, and I learn from them and also exercise some influence on them and nudge them in the direction that it leads us to a better, safer, more resilient world.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that experience, all three phases in UNDP and some of the lessons learned. And then you move to your home country and into a leading role at the national level. So would you like to reflect a little bit on the opportunities and the challenges that you faced in the last 6, 7 years now, 7 years maybe?
Oh, I think so. From while I was at UNDP, there was this opportunity at the National Disaster Management Authority to be in the leadership team of the National Disaster Management Authority, which is chaired by the Prime Minister, and I was nominated for that. So this was an opportunity which was, in many ways a dream come true, to sort of apply all the learnings from the world that I have gathered into my own home country. So it has been truly, truly rewarding, fascinating, challenging experience in so many ways. I don't even know how to build a narrative around it, but let me highlight 4 or 5 main things. The first thing is that while you work for an international or regional organization, of course, there are accountability frameworks there as well. You're responsible for results. But when you work for the government, that accountability, that public scrutiny becomes several times much more real. You are always expected to rise up to the occasion. You can never say that it is someone else's job. It is always your problem. You always have to rise to the occasion and do the best you and your organization can do. You can't hide behind your narrow specialization and say that, sorry, this is not what I do. If there's an event in Visakhapatnam where a chemical accident has happened, chemical disaster has happened in the middle of a pandemic, you have to figure out what is really going on and how we can muster the resources of the state to provide the best possible support to our people and do the best we can to avoid the recurrence of such a thing. So I think that is really, you feel that sort of weight of accountability and public scrutiny in working for the government. So that's very, so it is of course challenging, but it's also very rewarding. So you have questions that come from Parliament, you have questions right to information, you have questions that courts ask. So I think you really understand how the accountability frameworks work, and it becomes really much more real. So that's one. The second thing, which is very exciting, is that at the apex level, the kind of resources you have available, and by resources, I'm not just talking about money. Money is always limited. You never have the money that you want, but that's not what I'm referring to. Resources meaning technical resources, capacities of a whole range of institutions, whether they are working on geophysics, earthquake engineering, space research, glaciology, water resources management. The challenge, of course, is how do you bring them together in a coherent framework to actually make things change for the better on the ground. So I think that is the second most exciting thing about working with the government. The third thing is that you begin to see the connection much more clearly between the policy movements and its impact on the ground. It becomes much more real. So you become as sitting in a position like this, much more acutely aware of implications of policies on people. It becomes very real, and you become much more cautious, much more thoughtful, much more consultative, and in many, many ways, it makes you very, very humble, because the history is full of unintended consequences of policies, which were designed with very good intention. The fourth thing about working with the government, particularly in the current context here in my job, is the ability to work, to do international work from a different perspective. So a nationally driven, multilateral agenda. So I think that, sort of, in a sense, a demand-driven, nationally led international agenda, a multilateral agenda of resilience is very interesting, and it gives me a completely different perspective from the one I had when I was myself working for a multilateral organization. And finally, I think for me specifically, it's really like, in many ways, rediscovering my own country. It's a large country, it's a diverse country with diverse challenges with regards to risk and resilience. So seeing different parts of the country, engaging with communities, across a huge spectrum, is a very rewarding experience. And you see that such a lot of work is being done by people themselves, and that's a huge source of inspiration and learning as well. So I wouldn't trade this job for any other in terms of the ability to get things done. Of course, it is enormously challenging, but also rewarding like nothing else I can imagine at this point in time.
No, thanks. Thanks, Kamal, for very rich insights. So the question which I'm going to frame is, and it's there in the list sent to you, what are the main lessons or insights gained in the early days that are still relevant today? So do reflect on both your work in the field as well as at global level and national level. So that's one. And I'll ask the second question as well. I may repeat it later. How do you see the field now? And since the time you first entered, what are the changes for good as well as for bad that you can reflect on?
I think the lessons from early days that are still relevant, basically, there are three I would sort of highlight as top line. The first lesson is that, pursuing disaster risk management as a hazard science-driven agenda is really not going to solve the problems. That is not to say that we don't understand better understanding of earthquakes, better understanding of volcanoes and landslides. But as long as we continue to drive it only from the hazard side, we will always have limited impact. And unfortunately, still in many countries in the world, the hazards community tends to capture the larger share of limelight in the discussion. So it has changed. Of course, there are many more social scientists who are in this field, but still that dominance has somewhat persisted. The second thing is our inability to get out of our comfort zone and talk to people from diverse backgrounds. I'm not just talking about communities. And the pandemic, for example, is a classic example of that. I don't think Many people would have spoken to epidemiologists before the current pandemic. Many people who have been working on floods, for example, or cyclones. So I think, and whereas both people who work on, say, managing risk of losses from cyclones, as well as managing risk of losses from an epidemic, both are dealing with risk, but because they have never spoken to each other, they don't have a common risk language. So I think that is really something which is still true, that we tend to stay in our comfort zone. We don't talk to people outside our comfort zone. The third is, again, the issue of which is often labeled as mainstreaming, that we have to find a way, we have to have capacities to work on how different sectors work, how development happens. We've been talking about it for the last 30 years, but I think the progress has been slow. And we also do not have the capacity that is needed across the world to actually make that happen. So, and that is a big challenge. There's a big capacity gap which is across the world, both in developed and developing countries. And because what you need is not sort of disaster risk management expertise from outside to come laterally into a development field, but a risk management expertise which grows within a particular development sector or a set of development sectors. So I think these three challenges have persisted. Hazard-centric approach to disaster risk management, our ability to cut across disciplines and evolve a common risk language, and three, capacity gap for building, nurturing risk management within the sector. So I think these are the three things. There are two things that I want to just highlight very quickly here. The first thing that has changed is that the area of practice has come of age. So it is an established area of practice. It is not just a niche where very few people are working. So that is a good thing. And I think it is widely recognized that there is something to it. And this is not just an eclectic area of work, and this is something which can benefit society as a whole, and it needs to be nurtured. I don't think back in the early 90s there was a single master degree program in India. Now I think there must be more than 30 universities, colleges offering master degree programs in disaster risk management, which is not to say that this is enough, but it definitely is recognized as an area of work. Today, many jobs actually require you to have a degree in disaster risk management. If I were to start my career again, my current educational qualifications will not qualify me. So, which means that, either you have to study or you have to have a few courses in disaster risk management. So that's a good thing. The second thing that has changed is there are definitely more resources available now. We, at NDMA, we work very closely with the Finance Commission. We have dedicated resources for risk reduction. We have dedicated resources for recovery and reconstruction. We have dedicated resources for capacity development. We have dedicated resources for response. So much greater predictability. It may not be enough, but much greater predictability in terms of availability of finance for disaster risk management. There is a lot of work happening on the frontiers of innovation to take it to another level, to mobilize private finance, to have a more structured system of disaster risk finance. So these things are really things which have changed for the better. There are a couple of things that perhaps we need to sort of revisit in light of the most recent experience of the pandemic. And I will just highlight two. One is that, of course, we've been talking about mainstreaming and having resources for risk reduction in the sectors and not having an isolated, quote unquote, sector of disaster risk management. I think with the experience of the pandemic and with the experience of other large events, I am coming around to a view that as far as money is concerned for disaster risk management, while we need to mainstream it, we also need to ring fence some resources that are available for protection, for social protection, for response, for recovery, for risk reduction. So you actually need both. You need mainstreamed resources and you need separate, clearly identified resources for disaster risk management as well, all aspects of disaster risk management. You don't want to mainstream disaster risk management beyond recognition too quickly, because the level of risk, the level of vulnerabilities that are there are such that they will precipitate disasters, and we need a predictable mechanism for supporting people, either in reducing their vulnerabilities preemptively or responding to them when the events happen. The second thing is in the last few years, but also in the late 90s, the notion of community-based disaster risk management, the notion of local level risk management, since the 2016 Humanitarian Summit, the localization agenda has gained a lot of traction, and it is very, very clear, very strong case for it. But we are also seeing now that there are some functions that have to be efficiently performed, not at the local level, but at either a mid-level or at the central level. The role of coordination, how do two local entities coordinate between themselves when action of one local entity has the implications for the other and vice versa? Who coordinates between them? Who sets the rules of interaction between multiple local level entities? How do you manage risk at the local level when you are living downstream and you're not even aware of what you're living downstream of? So this is the new world where all of us live downstream, and to advance community-based disaster risk management or local level risk management as a dogma, as a panacea for all problems of risk is not right. This is not to say that community-based disaster risk management, localization is not important. It's supremely important, but it has to be pursued alongside strong capacities at the middle level, at the central level, to actually put the whole system together. I think that is really important to recognize and work systematically on.
Thanks for your answers, reflections, and sharp articulation of the continuing challenges which all of us collectively face. And let me switch back to, at a personal level, who have been your main influencers? You mentioned Ian Davis. You talked of some other names. Who would you list as your 3 top influencers? One question, and any.
My top 3 influencers will be David Hollister. I think one, for 2 reasons. One, because he had a similar educational background as mine, architect, urban planner. So we had similar sort of technical upbringing. 2, because of his openness to learn new things. He never, the kind of humility he brought to the job was quite quite inspiring. And he also was very scared of being labeled as an expert. And that was really, really remarkable. And of course, now, for the last so many years, I've been working with Andrew Mascari with UNDP while he was with DRR, and he has been really a thought leader in this area. He has influenced, more than a generation of people's thinking. The first series of community-based disaster risk management programs we did in ADPC was under his leadership. And then there are influences that may not necessarily be from disaster risk management field. And I may not even have worked very sort of closely with them, but one is inspired by them. I mean, the work that we did at ADPC on climate and how Subaya took it off to another level in RIMES, it's really impressive. And so many ways it's very inspiring because Subaya demonstrated a global South-led multilateral initiative, which really works, and which is, to my mind, the best value for money in the multilateral space right now. And you can't go to any seasonal forecasting meeting in any Met service in my region where RIMES doesn't come up, where Met services do not look at RIMES as their multilateral organizations designed to service them. And then, of course, there are people from other fields, how people carry themselves in the fields of, arts and, economics. And
lastly, would you list 3 or 4 or 5 publications that have had a major impact and influence on your thinking and approach?
I think, of course, I mean, the thing is this, that some of the publications which had major influence on me, you could perhaps now say that they are dated, because that conversation has become even more advanced now. But that doesn't mean that those were not influential. So I would say that Andrew Mascari's book on community-based disaster risk management, it's a thin book. I don't know when it was written. That was very influential. Ian Davis's book, Shelter After Disaster, where, it was really nice book with a lot of pictures and with Ian's sharp wit also sprinkled all over it. That is another one. Fred Cuny's book, Development and Disasters. I think, I forget, there were 3 authors, I think. Robinson's book on Rising from the Ashes. Of course, Davis, Blakey, Wisner et al., At Risk, that came out in 1994, I believe.
It's been a very rich interview, and certainly valuing both the past background which you shared as well as this. It's a valuable addition. So I feel
thanks a lot.
It's an honor to have had the opportunity to interview you.
Come on.